When you think of the European Union, is it the anthem, the flag, or Brexit? For many, the EU is now synonymous with the UK's dramatic exit. The UK, home of Shakespeare and the Beatles, stormed out in 2016, citing sovereignty and fish, leaving the EU with a PR disaster and a sense of existential crisis. Brexit wasn't just a tantrum, it was a symptom of a deeper malaise, rising nationalism across Europe, challenging the very purpose of the EU. So, is the European Union falling apart? To answer that, we need to look at its origins, what's pulling it apart, and whether it can stitch itself back together. To really understand the EU's current troubles, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the ashes of World War II. Europe was devastated. Cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions of lives had been lost. The continent was desperate to avoid repeating the horrors of the past. The question on everyone's mind was, how could they make sure this never happened again? After decades of devastation and 2 world wars in less than half a century, Europe's leaders realized that the only way to prevent another catastrophe was to bind their economies and destinies together. They believed that if countries were connected, if their industries, especially those needed for war, were shared, then fighting each other would become not just undesirable, but nearly impossible. That's where the Schuman Declaration came in 1950. French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed pooling coal and steel production, the very resources needed to wage war. By putting these industries under a shared authority, war between France and Germany, the old rivals, would become not just unthinkable, but practically impossible. This bold idea led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the first step in a long journey. Over the years, this cooperation deepened. In 1957, 6 countries signed the Treaty of Rome, laying the foundation for a common market. What started as a small club of nations grew step by step into the European Union we know today, with its own parliament, laws, and even a shared currency, the euro. The EU's goals were nothing short of revolutionary: to create a single market where goods, services, people, and money could move freely, to break down borders and foster cooperation, and above all, to secure lasting peace on a continent that had seen too much bloodshed. In recognition of its success in turning enemies into partners and maintaining peace for decades, the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, a symbol of just how far Europe had come since those dark days after the war. Over time, the club expanded from the original 6 to 27 members, each bringing their own history, culture, and ambitions. The EU became a vast, complex union, weaving together a patchwork of nations under a single set of rules and institutions. But for all its achievements, the EU remains a work in progress, a currency without a country, a market without a fully unified government, and a set of ambitions that often outpace the political will of its members. The story of the EU is one of hope, compromise, and constant negotiation, a grand experiment still searching for its final form. The European Union has always been a patchwork of cultures, economies, and histories, but today, its old family arguments, North versus South, West versus East, have exploded into deeper, more unpredictable divisions. What once seemed like manageable differences over budgets or migration have now become fundamental disagreements about the very future of the Union itself. The sense of unity that once defined the EU is being tested as never before, with cracks appearing not just between countries but within them. Across the continent, nationalist parties like France's National Rally, Germany's AfD, and Italy's Brothers of Italy have surged in popularity. These groups, once on the political fringes, are now shaping the mainstream debate, united by skepticism of Brussels and a call for national sovereignty. Their rise is fueled by frustration over economic stagnation, fears about migration, and a growing sense that the EU is out of touch with ordinary citizens. In some countries, these parties are even threatening to upend decades of centrist politics, making coalition governments more fragile and consensus harder to reach. This political fragmentation makes agreement on big issues, like defense, migration, and economic reform, nearly impossible. EU summits that once ended with carefully crafted compromises now often break down in acrimony, with leaders unable to bridge the widening gaps between their countries' interests. The sense of shared purpose that once drove European integration is being replaced by suspicion and rivalry, as governments look inward and prioritize national agendas. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how much Europe still relies on the United States and NATO for its security. While the war has prompted calls for a stronger, more unified European defense, the reality is that building a true EU army remains a distant dream. Deep disagreements over military spending, strategy, and even basic foreign policy goals have left the continent vulnerable, with no clear path toward greater self-reliance. Meanwhile, the old binaries that once defined European politics are blurring. New, shifting alliances are emerging on everything from climate policy to relations with China. Some countries push for aggressive action on climate change, while others worry about the economic costs. On trade and technology, the EU struggles to speak with one voice, as national interests pull the bloc in different directions. The EU was originally built to manage disagreements among a handful of similar Western European nations. Today, it's struggling to hold together a fractious family of 27, each with its own history, priorities, and political pressures. The dream of ever closer union is being tested by the reality of ever deeper division, as the challenges of enlargement and diversity strain the institutions designed for a simpler era. The Economist recently called Europe more vulnerable than it's been in decades, precisely because these fractures are so complex and so difficult to heal. The headlines across the continent reflect a growing anxiety about the future, as citizens and leaders alike wonder whether the EU can adapt to a world that is changing faster than its institutions. The question is no longer whether the EU can manage its differences, but whether it can survive them. As the world becomes more unpredictable and the challenges more daunting, the fate of the European project hangs in the balance, its future uncertain, its unity more fragile than ever before. The rule of law is the EU's foundation. Everyone, from governments to citizens, must play by the same rules. But countries like Hungary and Poland have challenged this, undermining courts, media, and minority rights and daring Brussels to respond. The EU has tried legal action and withheld funds, but leaders like Orban use their veto power as leverage, turning the rule of law crisis into a high-stakes standoff. This creates a dangerous precedent. If some members ignore the rules, the whole system is at risk. The result is a two-tier Europe, one committed to democracy, another drifting toward illiberalism while enjoying EU benefits. The rule of law crisis isn't just legal, it's a battle for the soul of the European project. Money is the EU's perennial fault line, frugal North versus spendthrift South. The Eurozone debt crisis exposed this divide. Northern countries bailed out the South but demanded harsh austerity, breeding resentment and mistrust. The euro remains incomplete, a shared currency without a shared fiscal policy. The North fears permanent responsibility for Southern debt, blocking deeper integration. The pandemic and energy crisis forced the EU to borrow collectively for the first time, hailed as a breakthrough by some, but seen as a one-off by others. As economic pressures mount, old arguments about who pays and who decides are back, threatening the union's stability. The EU's economic unity is still a work in progress, and the next crisis could test it to the breaking point. Migration is the EU's Achilles heel, touching sovereignty, security, and identity, and fueling nationalism. The 2015 migrant crisis exposed the EU's lack of a unified policy, with countries like Germany welcoming refugees and others building fences. The refusal to share the burden left frontline states like Italy and Greece feeling abandoned, deepening resentment. Years later, the EU still can't agree on a common migration policy, and the issue remains politically toxic. Far-right parties have seized the narrative, portraying migration as an existential threat and driving deeper divisions. The result, a fortress Europe, human rights concerns, and a solidarity crisis that undermines the Union's core values. For the EU to thrive, it needs more than a single market, it needs a shared identity. Programs like Erasmus fostered a sense of European belonging, but lately, national and local loyalties are resurgent. For many, Brussels feels distant and bureaucratic, fueling skepticism and making it easy to blame the EU for local problems. Globalization and integration have triggered a backlash among those left behind, leading to an identity crisis. People retreat to what's familiar. Language, history, tradition. Nationalist politicians exploit this, casting the EU as a threat to uniqueness. The EU has failed to create a compelling emotional narrative to rival the nation-state. Without a shared sense of us, the Union's foundation remains shaky. The EU stands at a crossroads: deeper integration or slow fragmentation. Fragmentation could mean a hollowed-out union with institutions intact but powerless, as nationalist governments chip away at EU authority. The alternative is bold integration, building a European army, a true fiscal union, and a unified foreign policy, requiring real transfers of sovereignty. Germany's leadership is crucial. A passive Germany could paralyze the EU, while an active one could drive renewal. External threats, Russia, China, US uncertainty, may force the EU to unite or risk irrelevance. The stakes are enormous, and the path forward is anything but clear. The next few years will define Europe's future. So, is the European Union falling apart? It's a question that's been asked more and more in recent years, as headlines warn of crises and fractures within the bloc. From the outside, the EU can look fragile. Its blue flag sometimes seems to flutter in the wind of uncertainty, battered by political storms and public skepticism. Maybe. Nationalism is on the rise, and internal divisions over migration, budgets, and values have created a perfect storm. In many countries, people are questioning what it means to be European, and whether the EU still serves their interests. The sense of shared identity that once bound the continent together is being tested like never before. Brexit proved that European integration isn't a one-way street. The departure of the UK shattered the illusion that membership was forever, and showed that the EU's survival is not something to be taken for granted. It sent shockwaves through the continent, raising fears that other countries might follow. Yet the EU has a remarkable history of muddling through crises. When the pandemic hit, member states came together for collective borrowing and vaccine distribution, showing a new kind of solidarity. And in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine, the EU found unity and resolve, standing together in ways that once seemed impossible. The EU's economic power, its single market, and the web of legal agreements that bind its members make collapse both costly and difficult. The euro, the world's second most traded currency, is a symbol of this deep interdependence. But as challenges mount, simply muddling through may no longer be enough to secure the future. The EU now faces a crossroads. It must decide whether to integrate more deeply, pooling more sovereignty and acting as a true global power, or risk sliding into irrelevance in a world increasingly shaped by giants like the US and China. The stakes have never been higher. Ultimately, the EU's future won't be decided by bureaucrats in Brussels alone. It will be shaped by the choices of its member states, their leaders, and most importantly, their citizens. Every election, every debate, every protest adds a new chapter to the story. The debate isn't over, it's just beginning. Is an ever closer union just a dream, or is it Europe's best hope for peace, prosperity, and influence in the world? The answer depends on the willingness of Europeans to imagine a shared future, and to work for it. The answer is still unwritten. The next chapter of Europe's story will be determined by the choices made today. What kind of Europe does the future need?